Hello everyone, this is CJ with Cycletron. Today I'd like to give you my advice for planning a long distance motorcycle trip. I'm sure like many of you, I didn't go on a long distance motorcycle trip this year, but you can bet that's going to change next year. So now over the winter months, this is a great time to be planning that trip. Now, I want to go over two aspects of planning a long distance motorcycle trip. The first is philosophical and the second is logistical. But before we get started, I would appreciate it if you would please like and subscribe and leave any comments you might have down below. Now let's get started. Now it may seem odd to say that the philosophical area should be addressed for long distance trip planning, but in many ways I think it is of equal importance to the logistical side of things. By putting the meaning of your trip in proper context, you'll be able to enjoy your experience to the fullest. Usually we plan a trip with a particular destination in mind, and once we reach that destination, we often have particular activities planned. Unfortunately, not everyone has a good riding vacation experience for a variety of reasons. It turns out that having troublesome vacation experiences is nothing new. One of my favorite authors among the ancient authors is Seneca. He lived 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. He was well known for the advice he would give people in his writing, which often took the form of letters to friends. Some of these friends were real and others were no doubt fictional. There is a collection of his letters in a book titled Letters from a Stoic, and it's in letter 28 that he talks about vacations. In this letter, he's writing back to a friend who had traveled great distances to go on vacation, but found himself unable to enjoy himself because he couldn't shake off the negative feelings that led him to want to go on vacation in the first place. Seneca wonders why his friends thought that by merely traveling long distances to take in new sights that he'd be able to transform his mood. Seneca then quotes Socrates to the effect that going on vacation didn't improve his mood because the person brought himself on the trip. Seneca goes on to say that a person like this is merely running away in their own company. So what is the solution without waxing too philosophical here? The point to me is that the journey itself should be about transformation. And taking a long trip on a motorcycle presents many opportunities for such transformation, particularly when compared to traveling by car or airline. I'll give you a few examples before getting into the logistics of trip planning. First, in your mind, when does your motorcycle vacation begin? To me, the vacation begins the moment my bike leaves the driveway. Unfortunately, for some people, the vacation in their mind won't begin until they reach their destination. They may be preoccupied with getting from their home to the vacation destination as quickly as possible, which in my opinion can lead to missing a lot of enjoyable things along the way and sets them up for disappointment if they don't reach their destination as planned. So how can we make the motorcycle trip a transformative experience? First, remind yourself that you're riding your motorcycle instead of being at your job. You'll get to ride for hours and hours, if not days, which is something you typically won't be able to do. The other is to enjoy your encounters with other people along the road. People will usually spot someone on a motorcycle with a lot of extra gear and naturally understand that that person is on a journey. They're often curious about where you came from and where you're going. Such encounters are common at gas stations, restaurants, and at hotel stops. I take the time to talk with these people who often share their own stories of motorcycles they've owned and trips they've been on in the past. If I was in a hurry to just gas and go, I'd be missing out on these stories and the encounters with these people. I also typically try to avoid interstate travel as it can be too homogeneous an experience in my mind. You know, you see the same type of gas stops, the same type of fast food restaurants, etc. It seems to be just one corporate enclave after another. Instead, I try to travel the state highways whenever possible. I try to eat at locally owned restaurants and stay at locally owned hotels. One time in Texas, my oldest son and I were about 700 miles from my home. We went to a locally owned Mexican restaurant for breakfast. We like to eat a lot of Mexican food on these trips, by the way. The waitress noticed our riding gear and asked where we were from. When we told her Kansas City, she surprised us by saying she had never heard of it. We got a chuckle out of that as it made us feel as though we had traveled halfway around the world. But I truly love Texas. People in the hill country will pull clear over on the shoulder to let you pass so you can go forward on your bike. The other thing for me on these trips is to be very flexible on how many miles I travel each day. If my vacation plans depend on me traveling 500 or 600 miles a day for each day of the trip, it won't be very fun. I try to plan for about 250 to 400 miles a day with an occasional 500 or 600 mile day if needed here and there. But I'm also prepared to change my routine or even abandon going to the originally planned final destination in favor of spending more time at any particular place I encounter along the way, or to even return home sooner than expected if necessary. As an example, last year I took my 13-year-old son at the time on the back of my Harley on a long trip. My oldest son, who was 22 at the time, followed us on my Ducati Multistrada. We took this trip early in March when they were on their school spring break. Our plan was to ride from Kansas City to Big Bend National Park in Texas near the Mexico border, a distance of about 1,000 miles. Taking a long trip like this in March in this part of the country can be risky relative to weather, and we definitely experienced this on this trip. By our third day, we were staying in the West Texas town of Marfa, which is about 150 miles away from Big Bend National Park. That night I was going through the TV channels at our hotel and discovered that a massive line of thunderstorms was sweeping eastward along about an 800-mile line, and this line would reach us within 2 days. They call this type of storm a derecho. Here's a screenshot of that weather radar that day. The storm was producing 60, 100-mile-an-hour winds and 24-hour rain totals of over 12 inches. I realized that we could go to Big Bend just fine the next day, but we'd be stuck down there for several days while the storm passed. I decided we had to head back home instead, just 150 miles short of our planned destination. It turned out to be the right decision. The next day we rode 650 miles to Guthrie, Oklahoma in the dry, and then the last day we rode 350 miles in the rain, and it was 38 degrees the whole time. At first, my kids viewed the trip as a complete failure until I pointed out all the fun we had riding motorcycles for 5 days, and all the places we had seen, the food we had eaten. I admit the last riding day was pretty uncomfortable, but it was still an adventure. So let's switch gears and talk about the logistics of trip planning. First, where do you plan to go? I like to plan trips over the winter months when snow or ice is keeping me indoors. I study road maps and review not only potential destinations but also possible routes. I also like to look at these Butler motorcycle maps to find particularly scenic or fun motorcycle routes along the way. I plan out roughly how many miles I'd ride each day. I might plan longer riding segments early in the trip and shorter riding segments later in the trip to account for potential fatigue. I consider where I might spend the night on my route. I might write down the name and phone number of places I might stay so I can make reservations when I'm a few hours away during gas stops. I will note the location of motorcycle dealerships along my route in case I need service for some problem. I plan out where I can get gas along my route, particularly if I'm riding with someone who has a bike with a small tank. And speaking of gas stops, be sure to notify your credit card company or bank that you'll be traveling so they don't decline charges on your card due to triggering a fraud alert. I usually realize I've forgotten to do this when my card gets declined at my 4th gas stop for the day, and I'm not even halfway across my neighboring state. I also bring a spare credit card and some cash. As far as packing for this trip, these types of trips, I go as light as possible. I may only bring a couple of pairs of shirts and pants with multiple changes of underwear and socks. I'll also bring a few key hand tools like wrenches, pliers, screwdriver, tire pressure gauge, etc. If my bike burns a bit of oil, I'll bring a quart with me. I'm careful how I pack things so hard objects are not touching fragile objects or even the bottom or sides of my hard bags, as the engine vibration will cause chafing. For this reason, you may also want to make sure none of your bags are in contact with the painted surfaces of your bike. I make sure that my bike maintenance has been recently performed and that my tires have enough tread to safely make the planned round trip. I bring a heated electric vest with me and at least 2 pairs of riding gloves. The gloves tend to get moist from sweat after a long day of riding. I also bring several layers of clothing. The most important part of your body to keep warm in cold weather is your chest and abdominal area. If you have good core warmth, your body won't cut off circulation to your hands and feet. Obviously, this is important for working the controls on the motorcycle. I pack clothes and electronic items in waterproof bags, inside trash bags, or in dry bags. I bring my cell phone and charger and basic first aid kit. If I have room, I also bring a spare pair of riding boots, since those can get sweaty or rain-soaked after many days of riding. If I'm riding in high heat, I will often wear a hydration pack so I can drink water while riding. Another important consideration is to have similar expectations on riding styles and daily distances if you have a passenger or you are riding with others. I once took a trip with a buddy of mine who couldn't manage to get his bike packed and ready to go until about 10:30 or 11 o'clock each morning, which drove me crazy. After about the fourth day of this, I'd had enough and I rode on to our next stop along the route so he could catch up later. I'll get more to what happened on that in a moment. On that trip to Texas with my 13-year-old, we've been riding several hours when my older son, who had been following me, shot past me in motion for me to pull over. He told me that his brother had fallen sound asleep and noticed him leaning off to one side on the seat behind me like a rag doll. After that, I made him hold his hand against the middle of my back, so if it slipped off, I'd know that he would fallen asleep. It never occurred to me that someone could fall sound asleep on the back of a motorcycle going 60 miles an hour. So you can see my philosophy on motorcycle travel is to plan things loosely, try to enjoy all the facets of the trip, and not get too hung up on reaching a certain destination or doing certain activities. Finally, there's the other aspect of how you can approach a long-distance motorcycle trip that I want to address, and that is the motorcycle trip where you have done little to no planning. This is what I tended to do when I was young. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but it certainly has provided me with some adventures and good stories. I mentioned earlier how I had that riding buddy on that long-distance trip that was too slow to get around each morning. That trip was 30 years ago in the early 90s. I ended up leaving him at the hotel around 8 a.m. and the plan was to meet him at the westernmost campground at Glacier National Park later that evening. Now, we did this trip in mid-September, which can be rather risky relative to early snowfall at those high elevations, particularly on a motorcycle. To me, Glacier National Park is one of the most scenic places in the United States, and it's certainly impressive to someone like me who grew up on the Central Plains. Well, I get to the campground around 6 p.m. as I recall, as it was starting to get dark. The campground was jam-packed, and there were a few spots left, but none were to my liking. On the way into the campground, I had seen signs for other upcoming campgrounds to the east, so I decided to push eastward through the park and find another campground. I passed one campground after the other, and they were all closed. Before I made it out of the park, I had already been riding an hour alone after dark on these very twisty roads with steep drop-offs. Finally, the easternmost campground was open, but was pretty full. The only spots open had really soft ground, and I figured that my 600-pound bike, I was riding a Yamaha GTS 1000, would likely fall over by the morning. So I left, and I stopped at the nearby $100 a night lodge. That's a lot of money, particularly for the early 90s, but I was getting desperate. Turns out the lodge was fully occupied. So I headed south on this twisty road and had to stop when I noticed this hulking figure in the road about 150 feet ahead of me, illuminated by my bike's headlights. It was a grizzly bear on all fours. It was huge. Its front paw was on the shoulder stripe and its back paw was on the center stripe. And even in a walking position, the bear was as tall as I was on the bike. I came to a stop and it stared at me for what seemed like forever before running off into the woods. I get going again, only to be startled by several large brown cows grazing near the road that I thought were grizzly bears at first. Finally, I get to this mom and pop hotel at 11 p.m. and they rent me their last room as they were getting ready to close for the night. The next morning, I went back to the first campground where my friend was still packing and drinking coffee, of course, who told me about the fun night he had spent at the campground. I'm sure there's a lesson there. He was quite a bit older than me, and he was taking in the experience at a much different pace. So, complete lack of planning will likely increase your odds of unexpected adventure, but will certainly increase the level of risk. This is not something I do anymore at my age, particularly if I have my boys riding with me. Well, that's it for now. What are your tips for planning a long-distance trip? Please let me know in the comments below. Also, please like and subscribe if you've not done so already, and I will talk with you again soon. Thanks a lot.